What's up YouTube, I'm Guy, and today we're talking a little bit about vintage watches and the vintage watch market. See, I received an email from a viewer yesterday looking for some advice on buying a vintage Rolex, and let's be perfectly honest, I am far from the best person to give guidance on this subject. I'm not very knowledgeable on the topic of vintage watches, and frankly it's not a segment of the hobby that interests me too much. So, while I can't give this viewer a real recommendation on the specific watches he asked me about, I do have some general advice on getting into the vintage world and an explanation as to why I tend to avoid it. The viewer sent me a link to an auction for a Rolex Air King reference 6552, if I remember correctly, with a price of about $2,500. He felt like it was an affordable way to get into a Rolex, and he asked what I thought about it. Well, at first glance, I noticed that the dealer selling the watch had good feedback, which is frankly promising. But this is a no-box, no-papers watch that seems to be of a rarer reference with unknown origins or service history. And the problem is, the quickest way to lose money is to buy something you know nothing about. So in my brief searching online, it would appear that the 6552 reference was a transitional model from the 1950s that ran a 1030 caliber movement. And let me tell you, as a prospective buyer, this scares me a little bit. There's no telling what state of condition the movement on a watch that old might be in, and whether or not it can be both easily and affordably serviced, either now or in the future. And this all hinges on having blind faith that everything in the movement and on the watch as a whole is completely authentic to begin with. So here's my advice, and frankly, this is my approach to the vintage watch industry, and it's really very simple. Take your time. If you're not willing to spend hours and hours to build a knowledge base and an understanding of this aspect of the market, I think it's best to completely avoid it. Dipping your toes in the vintage watch pool with a lack of understanding of the watches you're thinking about buying is a potential recipe for disaster. Now, at a minimum, you should really have already found and formed a relationship with a watchmaker who specializes in these types of watches that you know is both reliable and trustworthy. You need someone in your corner that you can trust not only to service these watches in the future, but also possibly to advise you on them once you've received them. Vintage watches with no known service history can end up being a total mess. They might be in a state of ill repair, or worse, have been hacked together over the years with random parts bin components to keep them up and running for the previous owner. And if you get a Rolex like that, the value of the watch can be seriously diminished. Without access to someone like that you can lean on, I personally wouldn't even entertain the idea of getting into vintage. Now, just like having a good watchmaker in your corner, I'd want to do my due diligence on vetting any potential dealers that I'd consider buying vintage watches from. I'm sure a lot of these dealers willing to sell vintage watches only know slightly more about them than you do, and they're just turning over inventory as fast as humanly possible. If they don't specialize in vintage and offer the highest quality timepieces, I wouldn't purchase from them to begin with. So, let me reiterate what I said before. If you want to jump into the vintage watch game, take your time. Spend a ton of time learning about the watches so that you can be an informed consumer. Spend a ton of time finding a watchmaker that you can rely on who specializes in vintage to help you with authentication and servicing of these timepieces. And spend a ton of time finding a dealer you know you can trust to deliver the best quality vintage timepieces to start with. Now, another reason why I don't delve too deeply into vintage, or frankly even pre-owned modern watches, is because of the propensity to sell something that they know has a problem, simply because they don't want to deal with it. This applies to more than just watches, and I've seen it time and time again, where someone has something that's malfunctioning and they can't fix it, so instead of dealing with it, they just sell the problem on down the line to the next guy. Hey, look, it happened to me once with an old Camaro. The car, it looked decent for its age, it had better than average miles, and I liked it. But within the first few weeks and a few trips to the mechanic, I realized I wasted a bunch of money. People, they do suck. And you can be sure that a fair number of used, pre-owned, and vintage watches being sold right now will end up taking you down the exact same path. And as a general rule of thumb, I just avoid those headaches. I buy new, or I make sure that I'm knowledgeable enough to avoid those pitfalls before I jump in. Look, this is all pretty common sense, and the sentiments here are simple. That is, be an informed and be a knowledgeable consumer. Heck, this even applies to buying modern or brand new watches. I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard from someone that bought a new watch at full retail price without shopping around or negotiating for any discount whatsoever. It's not the end of the world, But if you spent some time learning about the market, you'd find out that getting a 10, a 15, or maybe even 20% off of a brand new Omega Speedmaster is the norm. So don't just dive into any major purchase, be it vintage or new, without first spending the time required to learn about the market and the timepieces that you're considering spending your hard-earned money on. All that said, at least for me, the vintage watch market is best left to other people. There are so many watches out there that present less risk and more reward that my time is best spent on those. I've only been in this hobby for a few years, and maybe, at some point, several years down the road, I'll start to explore that aspect of the watch market. But for now, I have a lot more to learn, and I suggest you do the same and take your time. Alright guys, that'll wrap this video up for today. As always, thanks for tuning in and watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you've enjoyed this video, do me a favor, make sure you subscribe, click the notification bell, hit the thumbs up button, leave a comment down below as well, and let me know what your thoughts are in getting into the vintage watch market and how you would approach it. Also, check out the description of this video for a list of ways that you can help me out and support what I'm doing here on YouTube. Down below you'll find links to my social media accounts, my Patreon, and my Amazon and Audible affiliate links. And let me extend a big thanks to everyone that's been supporting me on Patreon with monthly donations, and to the guys that have been using my affiliate links. I really do greatly appreciate it. Well, until the next one, I'm going to sign off and I'll say bye now.